We have to recognize that when we walk out that door, we are in a country where scientific credibility is now a political issue. And we have that challenge of getting someone to eat fish and seafood who may think that getting vaccinated so they don't kill their families, friends, and coworkers is not a credible value proposition. Nonetheless, we have this great opportunity because, oh, sorry, I want to go back one slide. Wouldn't it be great if sustainable fish, seafood, and other marine ingredients made up a larger share of what we eat in America? Now, this is the Back to Basics conference, so this is Seafood Marketing 101. And this just isn't any marketing. This is marketing for a durable, lasting behavior change. We need to get people to move from a trial, let's eat seafood more often, not just this week, but for a long time. And also, we can't celebrate too soon because, as I'll talk about, and because of work we've actually done, other ingredient categories or councils and boards have also been successful in making the lasting change. So there's a proven path and there's competition. So we have a big goal that we are working on in partnership with SNP and all of you, which is to get more people to eat more seafood more often. When we talk internally, our goal is to drive up the amount of seafood we eat in America by 80%. It's something that we think can be done in a few years as long as production keeps up, because this has been done in other foods that we've worked on. But because we also have another issue in America, overweight and obesity, we actually need to get people not just to eat more seafood, we need to get them to eat more seafood instead of other stuff. We don't want people to eat a lot more food. We want a larger share to be seafood. And we don't want them to just get excited to do it once, but to do it over and over and over and over again for the rest of our lives and then theirs, because hopefully if they eat seafood, they'll live longer so they can do this longer. The good news is that we should be very optimistic as we figure this out, because we are in the midst of an enormous change in how we eat protein, something that we haven't seen in a generation, and actually more like 2.5 to 3 generations. Every year for the last 10 years, Changing Taste has asked consumers, American adults, how you feel about your protein choices. And every year the answers are about the same. There's a few people who are vegetarians or vegans, but a very stable 1/3 or a little more want to reduce the amount of red meat they eat. Only about half of people are comfortable with the amount of red meat they eat this spring, and that actually is down a substantial 8%. Previously, over half of us were comfortable with what we ate. Now we're down during COVID. And that change in how much red meat we eat isn't just an attitude, it is a behavior. Because in 20 years, we have seen the per capita consumption of red meat drop by 13%. That's more than 1 out of every 9 meals. That used to be meat is now something else. Or 1 out of every 9 ounces of whatever on the plate that used to be meat is now something else. Now, a lot of people say, isn't that plant-based? And actually, we're not eating plant-based meat instead. We tried that. And I just want to do a really quick snapshot of this because some of you were saying, isn't that the competition? Isn't plant-based the hot thing? So rates and amounts tell you different things. You're all scientists. This is the problem of the small denominator. Here are the year-over-year growth rates from, the pre-COVID to Q1 2021 growth rates for meat and also for meat alternatives or plant-based replacements. Boy, plant-based replacements are smoking this. Q1 2021 compared to that same quarter, just as we were coming into the shutdown. But if we look at the actual amount eaten and what those changes look like a year on later, you know, the amount of meat we've eaten compared to pre-COVID on a 90-day basis is up $98 million, or just about the same amount of all the plant-based meat alternatives we eat. And actually, when we do Q1 2021 to pre-COVID, we actually have dropped our consumption of plant-based meats. We have an article online and some other places where you can read about the trial and failure of plant-based meats, because frankly, they're not as easy to eat and they're not as easy to cook as fish and seafood, which is why over the last 2 years, we have seen that for the third of people who want to reduce their red meat intake, their number one choice is now to eat fish and seafood instead. This is an enormous market opportunity. 3 years ago, the number one choice was to try plant-based meat alternatives. That's tanked. They had their audition. They had what you might even say a sleepover date during COVID, but didn't pass. Now this translates into some good news. You have all seen fish consumption is up, right? You probably can tell me the number of every data point in the per capita fish consumption, newly adjusted, especially if you're in the industry. It is great, great news. But it's not actually replacing beef. While fish consumption is up 2.4 pounds over a couple of years, beef is down 9.3 pounds. And what we found in asking consumers, why aren't you moving on your intent to eat more fish and seafood? For a lot of people, it is this concern about ocean health. Not overfishing, not bycatch. It's about microplastics, mercury, industrial contaminants, use of forced labor and modern-day slavery that give people pause. And so what do you do when you have pause about eating fish and seafood? I know several of our presenters have talked about we've made it complicated. You eat more chicken instead. And so Americans are replacing red meat with even larger amounts of chicken. We actually have a whole conversion for bone-in and plate waste and all that, but the numbers are clear. So our challenge, if we want to increase fish and seafood consumption by 80%, production side is one, but the other is to change our attitude from it's time to eat more chicken to eat more fish. And I just want to say before we move to this next one, we made a decision as a company to work with Chick-fil-A, the largest buyer of chicken in the world, as long as they committed to go completely antibiotic-free and change the protein industry. For those of you who are watching, they went from the number 20 fast food chain in the US to the number 3, based on a few things. Because what drove the growth in chicken consumption also drove their success. First, people began to see that chicken is a healthy white meat. Such a successful health promotion campaign that for a while, pork became the other white meat, just to try and keep pace. But then chicken became antibiotic-free, a mark of better production. Then chicken became around animal welfare and better living or rearing standards for chickens and also hen-laying eggs. Then chicken became super convenient for kids and adults who eat like kids with nuggets. And then in the last 7 or 8 years, chicken became the environmentally preferable choice, a smaller carbon footprint than beef. And in the last 2 years, chicken has become a culinary delight. And the chicken sandwich wars have driven up interest in that chicken can taste different every time you eat it. So all of these steps have helped to keep marching up consumption of chicken instead of the beef we're getting rid of. But we know that chicken and fish are different. Now, some of these have just been covered in the last presentation. We know that we eat more by volume at home, more away. We know we eat more shrimp out and more fin fish at home. And we also know we desperately want to eat out. But there's 2 things about behavior in eating fish and seafood that I want to touch on. One is that even during COVID, we only bought fish as often as we shopped at the grocery store. 95% of us say 1 grocery trip equals 1 fish and seafood meal. That's stopping at the fish counter and knowing it's highly perishable. This didn't change much during COVID. The other is we desperately want to eat out. 80% of restaurants kept fish and seafood on the menu during COVID, still have it now. In July, and only because August numbers aren't in, a record $72.2 billion was spent by American consumers at restaurants. We had never spent more to eat out before. All of that as context. Let's zero in on our target to get to 80%, because we've thought about what are the first steps? Not all the steps we can do at once, but what are the first steps? And the first step is to get people who eat fish and seafood sometimes to eat it more often, twice a week or more, because that's easier than getting someone who eats a lot of fish to eat even more fish. And it's also easier than getting someone who really is scared of eating fish or has, as we know, megaricophobia, the fear of cooking a bad meal for others. The great news is that most people are these sometimes eaters. 2/3 of Americans eat fish and seafood between once a week to once or twice a month, or simply put, not as often as health advice would require. When we look at that target consumer, we've heard it during this presentation. It's low to moderate income, live outside of the cities, slightly more likely to be female, less likely to eat out. There's other things here. But we decided to look further and say, is there a difference between the person who's eating fish once a week and the person who's eating fish once a month? And the answer is substantial. The more we segment the market, the more we find the right communication strategies. Weekly eaters are actually more male, millennial, high income, consider themselves foodies, are more likely to eat out, and are concerned about environmental and animal welfare issues. The once or twice a weekers are the boomers who have been left behind by the health message. The 20% of so are boomers who decided to go, well, we're doing okay here, and I'm actually not that excited about food anyway. They also tend to be a little lower income. So when we think about how to get those people, and I use that non-politically correct term intentionally because there is no those people, when we segment the market for getting people to eat fish and seafood more often, there are boomers who can eat fish and seafood more often than once or twice a month, but current messaging has not reached them the way it has most of their peers and driven most of our growth. And then there are the Gen Zers and millennials who consider themselves so nearly immortal that this is how you handle COVID, during last Christmas. So what will drive increased fishing consumption? 3 things to think about communicating about. One is diversity of flavors. Now this is a map about the frequency of offerings, and we're seeing ahi, tuna, and octopus over the last decade soar as interesting offerings. People want variety, especially in the weekly eater who is a foodie. And the way they find out about new things is in restaurants. And if they have a good experience there, they'll go again. And if they have a good experience there, then they'll think about cooking it for themselves or serving it to others. Canned tuna during COVID, despite all the great growth, actually didn't go up a lot. We hoarded our tuna so we would have something to either eat or throw out the window during the zombie apocalypse. And we actually did a study that showed the more cans you bought, some people bought 5 or 6 cases, the more likely you were to eat none of it. My dear wife over there said to me in May of 2020, as I thought about opening a can of tuna, aren't we supposed to save that just in case? The next thing is, it's not just one motivation. For those who are already eating for health, the messages that we give have driven increase in fish and seafood consumption. This is a strong motivator. But for their older peers, it hasn't worked. And one of the key things may be getting them to eat fish and seafood more often than once per grocery trip. And messages about perishability, the use of smoked, cured, and frozen, other ways you can get a couple meals out of each grocery trip. And for the younger consumers, it actually may be the opposite. It may be about getting them to take another risk to have a delicious, interesting, novel experience because they are concerned about so many ocean health issues that they eat chicken. And lastly, to get that diversity of flavors, more fish and seafood items on the menus of more kinds of restaurants. Fish and seafood house sales have declined, but more restaurants than ever now menu fish and seafood, and this is where people can encounter new varieties and new preparations. This is a B2B message or a B2Chef message. These 3 keys we think can get us that 80%, and it's time to get cracking. Thank you.
Nice.